kicking off the day with some really tangible, practical examples from a variety of sectors who are already protecting health, reducing emissions and building resilient systems. That includes legal action, the work that cities have been pioneering, and actually the role of security. So let's meet our panel. Please come up and take a seat. We have Carl Asbury, come and join us, and we'll work out who's who when you're up here. Okay, helpfully, Carl is on the end. Carl Asbury is the lead for climate and health at the Resilient Cities Network. A lot of the really urgent and innovative change is happening at city level, as you'll hear. We've got Panos Tripontikas, and until yesterday, he was the Director of Intelligence at NATO's Allied Maritime Command. Wondering what on earth that has to do with climate and health? You will find out. We've got Laura Clark. She's the Chief Executive at Client Earth, where they use the power of the law to accelerate climate and environmental action. And we have Mike Tipton. You heard from Mike yesterday. As you know, he's the President-elect of the Physiological Society and Chair of this summit. So thank you all for joining us. Each speaker is going to give us 5 minutes, or up to 5 minutes, a quick overview of their work and why it's relevant. We'll have a couple of questions and then open it out to you guys. So, Carl, would you like to go first and kick us off?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Fiona. And it's a real honour to be on a panel with such powerful speakers and perspectives. I feel I'm most probably going to be repeating many of the points that have been reiterated through the course of the last couple of days and will be reiterated later as well. But my overall point is that we cannot solve a crisis of planetary scale if we keep on responding as if it were a series of isolated problems. And climate change, as you guys all know, is not just an environmental issue. It's a public health emergency. You know, as we heard earlier, health is, I think, the argument for taking climate action. But it's also a social justice reckoning. It's a systems failure. And nowhere, I believe, is that more evident than in our cities. So cities are on the front line of the climate and health crisis. They are where the consequences of national inaction and global systems failure show up most explicitly, whether that's through floods, poor air quality, infectious disease, issues around mental health, overwhelmed infrastructure, the list goes on. But cities are also where some of the most creative, integrated and people-centred solutions are taking root. Why cities? They're complex. Everyone can understand this. They're living systems. You've got the public sector, you've got the private sector, you've got academia, you've got civil society, you've got the health system, and most crucially, you've got residents, real people. Within one area, if you step outside your house or step outside this conference centre, you'll find layers of interdependent systems right in front of you. Transport, housing, infrastructure, education, waste, energy, economic activity, food, care, green and blue spaces, and more. And behind all of these interconnected systems are people with underlying health conditions, different levels of risk, different levels of access, agency, and resilience. But that complexity, I believe, can be viewed as a strength rather than a weakness. And I think cities are the perfect living lab for integrated whole of society responses, because everything touches everything else. And the ripple effects, good and bad, are visible very quickly. You don't need a decade to see impact. You can pilot, adapt, and scale within the same governance ecosystem. And critically, cities can act whilst others are still debating. They can lead, and many are doing so. And we did a piece of research with Yale University last year called Urban Pulse, where we interviewed nearly 200 city officials. And those officials are connecting climate, health and equity they're recognising the growing risk that the cities that they work within are facing, and they're eager to act. They want solutions that protect health and promote equity, not just looking at emissions reductions. So in part to try and meet that need, we've partnered with the Sustainable Markets Initiative Health Systems Task Force to help cities build the business case for prevention. And we're working with Mode Economics as a technical partner to develop a climate and health screening tool to help cities appraise interventions that reduce climate related health risks before they materialise. We're also building practical guidance grounded in city realities to show how preventative action can deliver better health outcomes, lower emissions and reduce costs. And as part of this, we've launched a community of practice with 22 cities across different regions around the world, in exploring in a very practical sense how to integrate prevention, health equity, climate resilience, and more. And there's a real common theme, where cities put people first and break down silos, and we've heard this word silos over and over again, action accelerates. But it's not easy work. Cities are bureaucratic monsters. And you need coordination across fragmented governance levels. Cities need access to integrated data, whether that's climate services data, public health surveillance, or environmental monitoring. And how do we connect these data sources together into something that is then actionable? It means looking across multiple and overlapping planning and budget cycles. But above all, it requires a mindset shift from reacting to emergencies towards investing in systems that reduce risk over time. So, to be clear, the case for prevention is not just about saving money, though it will save money. It is about protecting the right to live in dignity and health. And it's also about tackling those root causes of vulnerability, whether that's poor housing, poor air, limited access to care, exposure to environmental hazards and more. And it is about making space for communities to shape their own futures. So I believe what we need is alignment across sectors, across actors, across levels of government. We need to stop treating cities as endpoints of policy and start seeing them as engines of transformation. We need to get everyone on the same page. And as a final point, the problem is, of course, global, but the solutions, I believe, really need to be local. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That's the local to global thing. When you said you don't need a decade to see results, I think there's that kind of shoulder drops or oh, phew. But how can you then use the more local work you're doing at cities to actually instigate wider change at the kind of pace that we're seeing it in cities?
Yeah, so I suppose cities, the population of cities is 50% of the global population. That's going to grow in the coming decades to 70%, if not even greater. And cities produce 75% of global emissions. So the work that cities do is inherently, when you take that all as a quantum, is inherently global. And I think cities are in a really unique position in terms of the action that they can pilot to influence national and international policy. They can move faster and quicker, and they can lead the way for national and international policymakers to kind of take that on board. And I think also one of the things that we're really keen on as a network organisation is connecting cities and peers together to freely discuss their challenges, whether that's around governance. Governance is always a challenge, or financing, or data, and to share some of the solutions and successes they have had to inspire other cities to take action. There's a really clear example in Paris, where they pioneered the Oasis schoolyards model, where that's all about greening schoolyards and improving access to those those developed green spaces for the wider community. And that started off with a few schools in Paris. It's now spread across the city, and now we're working in the Philippines to kind of use that model to develop green schoolyards in Quezon City. So that's an example of a very local action then taking root and being scaled through cities being inspired by other places.
Fantastic. Panos, would you like to give us your overview? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Fiona. Before I begin, I will have to stand up. I'm not a native speaker. I'm a Lacon. I'm coming from Laconia, where the Spartan are. So I try to encapsulate everything that I feel that it's important into the words that I will share with you. And then I will be able to answer any questions you raised. If you will excuse me. Thanks. So before I start, I just, as Fiona said, I conducted my 3 years of appointment as a Director of Intelligence in Allied Maritime Command. So talking about maritime domain, we are talking about, it's from seabed to space, and it's not only what we see in the surface. And because sea lines of communications connects everything, we are talking about a vast domain of interest. And what happens there doesn't stay there, affects everything and the land domain. And today I will speak with my individual capacity, try to encapsulate all my previous years of engagement on climate change and security. So just a few hours from now, I will depart from the United Kingdom, but before that journey begins, I have the privilege to stand here and to speak in a forum that truly matters, a place where science, strategy, and human well-being meet. More than 2,400 years ago, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, wrote that he who would learn medicine properly must study the seasons, the winds, the water, and the places. In his time, there were no satellites, no hospitals, no diagnostics, and yet he understood something we are only now rediscovering, that human health is inseparable from the environment, that illness is not only a matter of the body, but a symptom of imbalance with the natural world. Today, we call this health security, but back then it was simply called wisdom. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a systemic threat to all foundations of health, to water through drought, salinization, pollution, etc., to food through crop failure, marine ecosystem collapse, and displacement, to infrastructure through fires, floods, and broken supply chains, and to people most visible, especially those forced to move. When climate displaces populations, it brings urban stress, mental trauma, disease spread in unstable zones, overstretched health systems. Even in the UK, during the 2022 heat wave, where I came just 18th of July 22, where the airfield of Luton was melted because of the heat wave. So I was impressed about what climate change can do also in UK in person. So these are not future threats. They are physical, present, and personal. While serving at NATO's Allied Maritime Command, I was also a member on the Bi-Strategic Command Climate Change and Security Task Force, trying to identify the climate change impacts on NATO activities. And I proposed over there the concept of military open science, that military platforms, ships, submarines, aircraft, and also personnel can incidentally collect environmental data using scientific protocols and share it with civilian institutions. Within this framework, Yes. So with this framework to explore the long-term implications of climate risks, the framework on climate change and security, I told you. Okay. And contribute also to NATO strategic foresight analysis and the future operating environment report, which now identifies climate breakdown and biodiversity loss as the most destabilizing forces facing the alliance. This is no longer a speculation, it's a doctrine in development, and it demands both scientific awareness and strategic humility. The legacy of HMS Challenger. So in 1872, the HMS Challenger departed Portsmouth, not to dominate, but to understand. It was a Royal Navy vessel transformed into the first global oceanographic expedition. Its mariners measured depths, temperature, salinity, founding modern oceanography. That spirit of military presence supporting civilian science lives in today, if we allow it, not to science ourselves, but to enable it through access. Why does it matter? Because good foresight begins with good data. Satellites see much, but not all. They cannot hear underwear. They cannot detect acoustic stress or weak biological signals. But our submarines can. And now I'm going to the second example. In the Eastern Mediterranean, I was the project officer of starting back in 1917. Our submarines began recording cetaceans and marine mammal voices, not for a tactical use, but for listen and support science. They detect marine mammals the submarines, they can detect marine mammals over 30 nautical miles away, offering vital insight on migration patterns, species disappearance, and acoustic stress links to human activity. These are early warnings, signs of ecosystems collapse, which ultimately affects human food chains and health. We can hand these recordings to scientific institutes, a small but real contribution to public knowledge. Military open science doesn't mean doing more in defense. It means seeing differently. It gives leadership a purpose, serving differently. We often think of security as a shield, but sometimes it is also the lens, the way we perceive threats before they arrive. To secure health, we must first secure understanding. To protect life, we must first respect it. Sometimes the most strategic act is to observe, a word that I listened also yesterday. Carefully, observe carefully, humbly, continuously. That is what military open science offers. Not command, not control, but contribution. And perhaps after all these years, we are not discovering something new. We are simply remembering what Hippocrates had already told us. Because when the air becomes unbreathable, when the waters become undrinkable, when the places we inhabit become unlivable, then what we lose is not just health, we lose direction. We lose measure, we lose the very ground of being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. It would be interesting to hear the sort of future potential for some of the work that you've seen within security, but applied to health and climate.
Yeah, so everything in NATO and in the task force, we see security with a holistic approach. So health is one part. Is what we can do in order to protect the people that they have problems because of the fires that we addressed that in Greece with several mega fires that we had the previous year, sending our units over there to pick up the people that they were already at sea. It's really stressful situations. And also for us, stressful situations, to see our people suffering and without being able, to do something more, because at the moment they need the first cure. It's something so we can see it, we already saw it. It's not that we are expecting to see the thing that we expect to see is that the security issues will raise if we don't do something. I mean, when we are talking about security, we are talking all types of security: food security, water security, economic security. All those securities affect the rights, the rights that we have as human beings to live. There are implications. And all affects, of course, the maritime security. And it's our way. We have to understand, to see the foresight. We need data. We need data first for all for us, but also for the scientists, because I believe that the best data we have, the best assessment we will give to the people. Otherwise, we will not be able to address the problem in the best way we can.
Thank you. Laura, please give us some examples of your work with using the power of the law.
Thank you. And it's a great sort of conversation, isn't it? Because it's how, as Jeremy put it, we bridge from the science into policy, from the evidence of what we know is going on in human health as a result of the climate and environmental crises into that real world action. And I think the law can provide what I call a really effective route to impact and bridging that gap. And I think it can do that both by putting the right legal frameworks in place, by setting out the right rights and plans, but also through litigation to really hold governments and corporates to account and drive the action and also behavioural change that we need. So let me give 3 examples of court cases that have done that have really centred the human rights and human health impact in the climate crisis. So a really seminal case, it was in Ogenda versus the Netherlands. That was a while ago, 2013 to 2019. It was very long running. But essentially, Ogenda argued that the government was endangering the human rights of Dutch citizens by not taking enough action on climate. Now, the court ruled that the Dutch government was legally bound to reduce emissions to protect human life, and ordered the Dutch government to reduce emissions by at least 25% by the end of 2020 compared to 1990 levels. So that's the human rights framing driving government action. As Client Earth, over the years, we've brought multiple clean air cases. We won 3 clean air cases in the UK, where the court ruled that the UK government was breaching the law on nitrogen dioxide pollution, and the courts ordered ministers to produce lawful air quality plans, which in turn resulted in clean air zones across cities in the UK, and a significant improvement in air quality, obviously from a very low base. We've brought similar cases in Belgium, in Italy. Right now we have one underway in Poland, representing 2 people with asthma who are claiming that the government is not doing enough to tackle air pollution and therefore uphold their rights. So, and we've seen across Europe an increase in clean air zones, partly as a consequence of this sort of litigation. The third example I want to give is very, very fresh. Just last week with Friends of the Earth Spain, we as Client Earth supported a community group in Spain dealing with the health and human rights impacts of pollution from animal industrial pig farming and poultry farming, the extraordinary toxicity, pollution of the air and water that they are putting up with. We were taking that case against the national and regional authorities of Spain, and the court ruled in our favour and said, and I quote, "Human rights and environmental protection are interdependent." Now, that's a case brought in the context of pollution, but the ramifications are very wide, that actually you cannot separate environmental protection from human health. This is something that we've, generations previously have always known. We are interdependent with, of course, the planet's health. So those cases show that that climate litigation and human rights litigation really works. It really can drive the change. But there is an opportunity to better integrate health arguments because health impacts are still massively underutilized in climate litigation. So the question then is, how do we do that? How do we drive greater impact in that way? Now, the UN General Assembly has recognised the right to a clean and healthy environment. Last year, in a case you might have heard of, the Klimaseniorinnen, the senior Swiss women, the European Court of Human Rights held that states have a human rights obligation to tackle climate change. So there is that recognition of that right, but it's how do you turn that into real world action? And I think that's perhaps the biggest opportunity we have to align health goals with climate action. And there are a lot of gaps. So for example, extreme heat is a growing public health crisis, but no European nation currently has a clear, comprehensive heat adaptation framework. We also know that the law on climate adaptation is relatively new and underdeveloped. So what do we need to develop that, to close those gaps? Well, we need to push for the right legal frameworks and protections. So for example, we need governments to adopt health action plans as part of their national adaptation plans under the Paris Agreement. But we also need more litigation to really crystallize the obligations on states and also the liability of big polluting industries. So let me unpack those two things. Firstly, we need cases against governments to really confirm that there is an obligation on states to protect life and health from the adverse impacts of the climate crisis. So when you bring those sorts of cases, that in turn leads to very clear obligations on states to adopt and implement sufficient climate adaptation and disaster prevention measures, and particularly also to provide for those that are most vulnerable, for old people, young people, those living in poverty and others needing special protection. So a legal case that really confirms states have a non-derogable obligation to protect human health from the climate crisis. Secondly, this is another interesting one, is not focused on litigation against states, litigation on big polluting industries. Now, attribution science is improving all the time. We need to be holding big polluters to account. We need to be making polluters pay. And so how you draw that connection between emissions and other forms of pollution and negative health impacts is really, really critical, because then once you start winning those cases on the principle, then you get class actions, you get damages claims, and that really, really focuses minds, shifts the calculations of these industries. And so that, I suppose, as I wrap up, that's where this conversation comes in. The question is, how can we collectively work to ensure that these legal cases are informed by the best possible science and evidence that really, really stands up in court, so that this climate health nexus can inform very, very successful litigation against polluting industries, focused on the obligation of states to take action to protect human health. And then that is really, driving, bridging, I suppose, that gap. It is the route to impact from the science and what we know needs to happen, and actually making sure that happens in the real world. Thank you.
Fantastic. So that we have enough time for questions, let's open questions up to the floor and to online, including Mike. He obviously spoke yesterday, so you've heard his words of wisdom already. So any from the floor, pop your hands up. Please keep them really short and questions rather than comments. We'll get to as many as possible, and I can also keep an eye on anything that's put in the Q&A. Straight away, we've got a couple, lots, okay, right. Here's a mic coming to the lady in the white shirt. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi, my question is around actually exactly what you just mentioned of the types of evidence that stands up in court. I'm wondering if you could just expand on what that means, where it's been successful, what helps, what, gets pulled apart.
Yeah. And I think that's about creating. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm also not a lawyer, controversially, even though I head up a legal organisation. But it is about getting a shared evidence base that really stands up to scrutiny, but also that judges are going to understand, that are going to be able to be heard. And I think that's about the health sector, legal experts, climate scientists, others working together to develop that robust and widely accepted evidence that stands up in court the way that IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, reports do for emissions. I recently joined the board of the Lancet Countdown on Climate and Health. It's doing exactly that, but we need to develop that evidence more. And I think that's really defining what health harms look like now, how they're projected to worsen, and then linking it to the cases. One of the real challenges often with these legal cases is they're very, very expensive, and there can be massive cost in commissioning that top-notch health expert opinion, expert testimony, because you need that expert testimony to really, bring it along. And that can be prohibitive for individual claimants or for civil society organizations. So that's something, again, where the movement needs to come together.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I'm not a lawyer. It's 1 out of 2 is not bad. I'm a scientist. So, but we've heard yesterday an abundance of high-quality information that would feed straight into what you've just been talking about, and that evidence comes from physiology. It comes from physiology to do with pollution, to do with heat, to do with flooding, to do with nutrition. So I think that's the connect we need. We don't just need a connect between the physiology in the room and policy. We also need it between the physiology in the room and what you do, because that will, in the law, because this is evidence, and these are the people in this room are the experts that you'll be using and arguing against when these things go to court.
Thank you. The gentleman with the blue jacket.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am really interested in the panel which has security. I have just, when we speak practically in terms of holding big polluters accountable, do you have an example of a model, for example, that works in a low and middle income setting? Because the big polluters are always the ones, I would say, running governments in most of the low and middle income countries. Like Cameroon, where I come, I know how much the fossil fuel has hold on the government, even the decision. So with the security person, I just want us to understand the framing, how this accountability, how we hold them accountable, who is doing this. If you have just civil society, as you have said, it's very expensive. Do you feel there is a mechanism where the security can be following up if this is something which is real with the health argument for, because we know for tobacco control, for example, the law was very clear that there is legislation that holds the governments accountable if they don't take action. So if you want to hold big polluters, is there any legislation in place in country that the security can enforce to make this to be positive and realistic? Because at one point, we have this feeling there is a disconnect between the security and the government holding the big polluters accountable in terms of law, legislation. Thank you.
I mean, I can try part of that. I mean, I think you have to have the right regulation at the state level around environmental standards, and then critically, it needs to be enforced. And often we have the right regulations, but they're not being enforced, whether that's because of the malign influence of the polluting industries on government or a question of capacity. But so you need proper enforcement from national authorities, and then where that fails, then you have litigation of the sort that my organisation does, others do. It's less developed in the global south. Often one of the opportunities to look at these multinationals who are having impacts in one part of the world, but they're headquartered in the UK or another jurisdiction, and that's often a way of coming at it as well. I mean, I'll leave Panos to talk about the security element.
You know, the security. It's policing the people that they are doing an environmental crime, and this is for police enforcement. And because in Greece, I will speak about Greece. You know, in Greece we have legislation. We have. I've seen several things. You know, about recently a vessel that after, of course, 5 or 6 years. Finally, they had the penalty for the environmental disruption. But from security perspective, we try to understand and see the foresight, the future, what it brings in order to inform the decision makers to do the proper action. This is very important. And we need to have a holistic approach. We don't have to work in silos, in compartments and everyone fighting for their part. This holistic approach, I think that we are missing. And just, do the obvious. I mean, not even think out of the box. If people do the obvious thing that needs to do, for sure we will see things that improved. We did it. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A. First of all, actually, Panos, whilst we're with you, how prepared is NATO's security for global food shortages from climate change?
Yeah, so I'm not able to speak on behalf of NATO, okay? I told from the very first beginning, but of course I can speak on behalf of my personal capacity. NATO is preparing to work on several types of security because we are trying to deal with the main threats and of course whatever other we will be able to face. We have the nations that are supporting the objectives of NATO, and yes, I don't. Maybe if it was a more specific question.
Thank you for attempting that. There was a lady in the pink shirt here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Nita Faroohi from Cambridge. So we've all acknowledged the urgency and the emergency that climate change is posing. But out on the ground, it doesn't feel or seem like an emergency because citizens got used to the pandemic and they understood what an emergency response looks like. In the UK, we had the hands, face, space, all of that. Elsewhere, similarly, the WHO engaged internationally. What could that look like for climate change and its impact on health? What does it, so I think messaging, communication, all of that is key. And of course, citizens need to know what government is doing or is promising to do, where they're doing U-turns, where they're going to continue forward and do even more, but also what citizens can do in their daily lives. How can citizens also, it's the collective, it's the government level action, but also the individual level action. So people eat food every day, people waste food every day. There are other things in the homes, of course. So how do we bring that together so that we carry everyone with us, not just the educated, not just those with agency, not just those who are, listening to the debates? Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Do you want to pick up?
Just very quickly, because it links into other areas where we've tried to do the same. What we're talking about is driving change. Everyone's talked about that, and there's various ways you can do it through the legal system, by informing politicians, by policy, by legislation. But a really good way is at the level of individual level response disaster, where people associate that their train didn't come, their hose didn't work, their grandmother died because of climate change. And I think that's an area where we haven't yet properly linked the disaster. So the other area I work a lot in is immersion and survival and drowning protection. Every single major advance came from a disaster. Titanic, Second World War, Cormorant Alpha, Piper Alpha, and it's disaster-driven change. And what you have with a drowning is somebody drowns and nobody argues that drowning didn't cause that death. And there's a whole organisations running on the back of that knowledge, like the RNI, for example. What I think we're less good at is saying that that problem was climate change. We might say, oh, heat wave, 600 deaths, but we don't say climate change, 600 deaths. And maybe we need to be better at informing the public about where these problems are coming from, because you're quite right, it's an emergency, and we mustn't, I just want to mention the word mitigation as many times as we can, because that should have started a long while ago.
And can I just add very quickly, it's also about how do we find people, because I think that one of the problems is defeatism, because people can't work out how they can get involved. So how do we increase the number of people who feel like they have agency? And there are the basic things you can do, who you bank with, where your pension sits, how you write to your political representative, your consumer choices. But there are other things as well. Lots of cities have got increased energy communities, for example. And so I think it's about how do we give people practical things where they actually feel they're part of driving the change.
I absolutely agree. The first step is them to realise they've got a problem.
Yeah.
And last word, Carl.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's a really interesting point. And we've been doing some work trying to build community resilience at a hyper-local level in a few cities across the world. And to actually converse and build kind of solutions and interventions with those communities, sometimes it's best not to go in with the climate change narrative, actually. You know, and you can take people on that journey, but actually it's meeting communities where they are in that present moment. Because if you go straight in and say, with the kind of mindset that, you know, climate change is an issue and you need to take action, 50% of that population will turn off. And actually, they're most probably the most impacted and most probably the ones that you want to hear from the most. So I think there is a bit of taking people on a journey and giving people, one of the things which I think has become a privilege is space and time to actually imagine new futures. And you know, that space and time for imagination, that's become a privilege. We most probably have a bit more space and time to think about these things, but lots of people don't. They're consulted and expected to very quickly give a response on the spot. They're not giving the space and time. So I think we need to build that space and time to take people on the journey, whilst recognising that the issues are urgent and we need to take action now at the same time.
What a very interesting set of experts. I'm sorry we've slightly overrun, which is eaten into your break time, but it is time for a break and then to head for your next sessions. But please thank our panellists.